Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting, or maybe it's under a starry sky with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. And if you're enjoying the moment, it would mean a lot if you could let me know where you're listening from, or simply tap the like button. It's a little thing, but it helps bring more people into this peaceful space. And if you feel like you'd like to hear more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. No pressure, just if you feel it. Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Moving into a new place is supposed to feel like a fresh start. That's what I told myself as I hauled the last box into the living room of the old house on Maple Lane. The hardwood floors creaked under my weight. The walls bore faded floor wallpaper, and the whole place smelled faintly of mothballs and damp wood. But it was mine, or at least mine for the next year. The house had been a steal, probably because it sat at the edge of town where few people ventured unless they were passing through. It was old, sure, but it had charm. The kind of charm you convince yourself exists when you're desperate to leave your past behind and need something, anything, to make you believe in new beginnings. Needs a little TLC, the realtor had said, her smile a little too tight. But you won't find another 3-bedroom at this price. I didn't ask why it was so cheap. I didn't care. After the divorce, I just wanted space. Room to breathe. Room to figure out who I was without the person I'd spent 10 years building a life with. So, I signed a lease, packed up my life, and moved to a town where no one knew me or the mess I'd left behind. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, rearranged furniture, and tried to get used to the house's quirks. The floorboards groaned under every step, and the old radiator made a sound like hissing snakes whenever it kicked on. There was a faint stain on the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, too, dark and shaped like an uneven ring. I told myself it was just water damage, and made a mental note to find a handyman. The neighbors were friendly enough, or as friendly as small-town folks get with outsiders. Mrs. Langley, the elderly woman from 2 doors down, waved when I was unloading boxes. She shuffled over the next day with a plate of cookies and a story about how her late husband had loved this neighborhood. "It's a good street," she said, her pale blue eyes crinkling at the edges. "Quiet mostly, except for that house." She gestured to mine with a quick flick of her wrist, as if pointing too long might bring bad luck. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, nothing to worry yourself over." She smiled, but there was something guarded about it. "Just, old houses like that, they carry memories." I laughed awkwardly, not sure what to say. Before she left, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Some folks say it's cursed." Nonsense, of course, but the last tenant left in quite a hurry. Middle of the night, I heard. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I chalked it up to small-town gossip. Every place has its stories, right? A house this old was bound to have a few skeletons in its closet, figurative or otherwise. The first night I noticed something strange was a Tuesday. I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone stepping on the floorboards just outside my room. I froze, heart pounding, and strained to listen. Nothing. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was the house settling, it came again, closer this time. My throat went dry, and I reached for my phone, fumbling with the flashlight. When I finally mustered the courage to look, the hallway was empty. The house was empty. I told myself it had to be my imagination, the remnants of a half-remembered dream mixing with the sounds of an old house. But when I got back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the end of the week, the little oddities had started to pile up. The creaks in the floorboards weren't confined to the upstairs anymore. They followed me, shifting from room to room as if something unseen was pacing through the house. My keys vanished from the kitchen counter one morning, only to turn up in the basement hours later, a place I hadn't even been. And then there was the smell. It started faint, like wet earth or decaying leaves. At first, I thought it was the plumbing, but the scent wasn't coming from the drains. It seemed to drift, always strongest near the stairs leading to the attic. I avoided the attic as much as possible. The single time I had ventured up there to store a box, I felt an almost physical resistance, as if the air itself thickened around me. There was nothing unusual about the space itself, just dusty beams and cobwebs, but the atmosphere was oppressive, heavy in a way that made my skin crawl. By Sunday, I was ready to chalk it all up to stress. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the isolation was starting to get to me. That's what I told myself, anyway, until I met Peter. Peter lived next door in a small, unassuming bungalow. He was in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a habit of keeping his hands in his pockets. He introduced himself one evening while I was struggling to haul a broken chair to the curb. "Let me give you a hand with that," he offered, grabbing the other end of the chair before I could protest. "Thanks," I said, relieved to have the help. Once the chair was set on the curb, we stood awkwardly for a moment, neither of us sure what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. "You settling in okay?" His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me think he already knew the answer. "Yeah, it's fine," I replied, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Just getting used to the place." He nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this before. "That house," he started, then hesitated. "It's got a reputation." I waited, but he didn't elaborate. "What kind of reputation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "People say it's cursed," he said bluntly. I don't know if I believe all that, but I've lived here a long time, seen a lot of folks come and go. Nobody stays in that house for long." "Why?" The word came out sharper than I intended. Peter shrugged, but there was a tension in his shoulders. "Strange things happen there. Noises, smells, some people say they've seen things. Shadows mostly, shapes that don't belong." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but the truth was, his words hit too close to home. "Anyway," he said, shoving his hands back into his pockets, "just thought you should know. If you ever need anything, I'm right next door." I thanked him and went back inside, my mind racing. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the creaks and groans of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until the clock struck 3 that I finally drifted off, the sound of distant footsteps echoing in my ears. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a nagging sense of unease. The events of the night before swirled in my mind, too vivid to dismiss as dreams. I went about my routine as best I could, telling myself I'd just had too much coffee too late in the day. By the time the sun had fully risen, the memory of Peter's warning felt distant and absurd. I busied myself unpacking the last of the boxes, trying to make the house feel more like home. I hung a few pictures on the walls, rearranged the living room furniture, and made a half-hearted attempt to fix the squeaky cabinet doors in the kitchen. Still, no matter what I did, the house seemed to resist my efforts. It remained cold and unwelcoming, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a break and explore the neighborhood. Maple Lane was quiet, lined with old oaks whose bare branches stretched like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Most of the houses were well kept, with neat lawns and cheerful wreaths on the doors. Mine stood out like a sore thumb, its peeling paint and sagging porch a stark contrast to the tidy homes around it. As I walked, I caught snippets of conversation from passing neighbors. A few nodded politely, but most seemed to avoid eye contact. It wasn't until I reached the small park at the end of the street that I met Lucy. Lucy was sitting on a bench, a faded green scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She looked to be in her 60s, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She glanced up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "New to town?" she asked, her voice gravelly but not unkind. "Yeah," I replied, sitting down a few feet away. "Just moved into the old house on Maple." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The Crawford place?" I nodded, surprised she knew it by name. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared off into the distance. Finally, she spoke. "You're brave. I'll give you that." I laughed nervously. Why does everyone keep saying that? She turned to me, her gaze intense. "That house has a history. Not the kind you'd find in the papers, mind you, but people talk. Always have. Strange things have happened there. Things that don't make sense." "Like what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She hesitated, then said, "You ever heard of Edward Crawford?" The name didn't ring a bell, so I shook my head. "He built that house back in the 1920s, she explained. "They say he was obsessed with the occult, held seances, rituals, claimed he could communicate with the dead. Some folks say he was trying to open a door to something that shouldn't be opened, despite myself." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And what happened to him?" Lucy shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. One day, he just vanished. Some say he ran off. Others think he died in the house and was never found. Either way, things were never right there after that." I wanted to dismiss her story as nonsense, but the way she spoke, the conviction in her voice, made it hard to ignore. "Do you believe it?" I asked, half hoping she'd say no. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I believe there are things in this world we're better off not messing with. And I believe that house has seen more than its fair share of those things." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and thanked her for the warning. As I walked back to the house, her words echoed in my mind. That night, the house felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and the creaks and groans of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate. I tried to focus on the TV, but every few minutes, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I climbed the stairs, the smell hit me again, earthy, damp, and faintly metallic. It was stronger than before, almost suffocating. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my heart racing. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight streaming through the window at the far end. I stood there for a moment, listening. The house was silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I forced myself to move, stepping carefully down the hallway toward my bedroom. As I passed the door to the attic, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. I turned quickly, shining my phone's flashlight at the attic door. It was closed, just as I'd left it, but something felt wrong. The doorknob gleamed faintly in the light, and I could have sworn it was turning, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation was gone. The doorknob was still, and the house was silent once more. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did, at least nothing I could see or hear. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers. If I was going to stay in this house, I needed to know what I was dealing with. The next morning, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. The house felt different, darker, more oppressive, and the events of the night before had stirred something in me. I needed to know what was going on here. If there was any chance of things getting worse, I wanted to be prepared. I spent the day rummaging through the house's old files, digging through boxes in the basement, hoping for some clue, some piece of history that would explain the strange happenings. But there was nothing. No paperwork, no family history, just some old receipts, dusty photo albums, and newspapers dating back to the 1950s. Frustrated, I turned to the one place I hadn't dared explore yet, the attic. It was on the third floor, a narrow staircase hidden behind a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. When I reached the top of the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop immediately. A chill spread over my skin, and I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, dust maybe, or forgotten junk from years past, but I wasn't prepared for what awaited me. The attic was small, cramped, and packed with boxes, furniture, and various other odds and ends. The air smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't place. It was stuffy up there, and the space felt stifling. But what caught my attention wasn't the clutter. It was the large wooden chest sitting in the corner, almost hidden behind some old chairs and a stack of old magazines. The chest was old, its wood dark and worn, with metal hinges that looked like they had been polished over time. It seemed out of place among the other items, as if it had been left there on purpose. I approached it slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My hands trembled as I reached for the latch. It creaked as I lifted it, and I felt a wave of cold air rush out from inside. The chest was filled with old books, papers, and what looked like faded photographs. At the top, there was a thick leather-bound journal. It was stained with age, the cover cracked and weathered. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The moment my fingers touched the leather, a strange jolt ran through me, a sensation that was almost like static electricity, but colder, more unnatural. I shook it off and flipped open the journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The first entry was dated from 1926. Asterisk March 12th. The ritual tonight went well. The air was thick with energy, but I could feel it slipping away, as though the door is only half open. I must not be afraid. I will continue. I have to. The power is within reach, asterisk. The handwriting was scrawled, frantic even, and the more I read, the more disturbed I became. The journal belonged to Edward Crawford, the original owner of the house, and the things he had written, rituals, invocations, experiments, were beyond anything I could have imagined. Asterisk April 4th. The shadows grow stronger. I hear them whispering in the walls. They speak of the door, the one I must open, but I must not fail. It's almost time, asterisk. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I continued flipping through the pages. Crawford's entries became more erratic, his handwriting less coherent. He mentioned summoning something, a presence, something that could not be seen but was always there, lurking in the corners of the house. Asterisk May 23rd. It is done. The door is open. I can feel them now. Watching. Waiting. I've done it. I've opened it. Asterisk. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. Asterisk June 1st. They are coming. They are here. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the attic felt thick, suffocating, and I quickly backed away from the chest. The strange coldness lingered in the room, like a presence that didn't belong. I could almost hear the whispers now, distant and faint, but growing louder the more I thought about it. I didn't want to believe it. It couldn't be real. But the evidence was in front of me, written in Crawford's own hand. He had opened something that shouldn't have been disturbed. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for all these years. I left the attic in a hurry, slamming the door behind me. The journal burned a hole in my mind, its words echoing in the silence of the house. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something invisible but undeniable, like a shadow that clung to my every step. I didn't know what to do with the journal. I didn't know what to believe. But one thing was clear. I had to get out. If the house was truly cursed, if there was something evil here, I wasn't going to stick around to find out what happened next. But as I stood in the hallway, staring at the door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floorboards above me. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was in the house. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened to the heavy footsteps above me. The sound wasn't a creak or a groan. It was a clear, deliberate step, one that seemed to be pacing back and forth, like someone trapped in a room, unable to escape. It wasn't the house settling, or the wind making noises. It was something or someone moving with purpose. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but the sound continued, growing louder and more distinct with every passing second. My eyes darted toward the attic door at the end of the hallway. I didn't want to go back up there, not after what I had read in the journal. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was making those footsteps was somehow linked to what Crawford had written. Against every instinct in my body, I moved toward the stairs, my feet dragging with every step. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I paused, listening for the sound again. There was only silence, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, charged with an unseen presence. My eyes flicked to the attic door, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move behind it, just a shadow, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know if I was being foolish or brave, but something pushed me forward. I had to know what was going on. I had to confront it, whatever it was. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. The cold metal felt like ice against my skin. When I opened the door, the air hit me, damp, thick, and unnaturally cold. I hesitated, then stepped into the darkness of the attic once again, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The space felt even more oppressive than before. The shadows clung to every corner, wrapping the room in a blanket of unease. The boxes were still there, just as I had left them, but the chest, it was open. My stomach lurched. I hadn't opened it when I left earlier. I closed it, snapped the latch shut. But now, the chest was wide open, its contents spilling out onto the floor in a chaotic mess of books, papers, and the leather-bound journal I had read just moments ago. I stepped forward cautiously, my breath quickening as I scanned the room. It was like the house was alive, shifting, breathing, waiting. The footsteps had stopped, but the air still felt charged, like static before a storm. I bent down to pick up the journal, my hands shaking as I flipped through its pages again. There was something different about it this time, though. The words seemed to move, shifting, fading, and reappearing as if they were written in ink that wasn't meant to be seen by the living. The pages blurred before my eyes, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if something were trying to break through, something far darker than I could comprehend. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped again, this time to an unbearable cold. I felt a rush of icy air against my skin, and then came the sound, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. But there was no door, not in the attic, not anywhere. The air around me grew heavier, as if it was filled with something solid, something pressing down on me. I could feel it now, a presence that was all around me. It was in the corners of the room, just out of sight, but its gaze was undeniable. Cold, calculating, hungry. I dropped the journal, stumbling back, my pulse racing. I was suffocating, like the air had turned to lead. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum that drowned out all other sounds. I had to leave. I had to get out. I turned toward the stairs, but just as I reached the first step, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, and then I heard it, the whisper. Soft at first, a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the walls. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew louder, clearer. The words were garbled, twisted, like a language I couldn't understand. The sound was coming from the walls now, from the floor beneath my feet. It was as if the house itself was speaking, and I was trapped inside its mouth. I turned, my back against the door, desperately searching for an escape. That's when I saw it, movement, just beyond my line of sight. Something, or someone, was standing at the far end of the attic, just inside the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form distorted, shifting in and out of focus like a mirage. I could see only the outline, no distinct features, no face, but the presence of it was overwhelming. It was watching me, its gaze so intense that I could feel it pressing against my skin. I couldn't breathe. The whispers grew louder now, too loud to ignore, and with each passing second, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet even further. I could feel the ice creeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. It took a step toward me. My legs gave way beneath me, and I fell to the floor, my hands bracing myself against the wooden boards. I scrambled backward, but there was no place to hide. The attic was small, the shadows closing in on all sides. The thing was coming closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, each one like a hammer on my skull. I had to get out. There was no choice. With one last desperate surge of adrenaline, I threw myself at the door. My shoulders slammed into it with all my weight, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, with a groan of wood and a snap of metal, the door gave way. I tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, but the oppressive cold stayed with me, following me, a suffocating presence that refused to let go. I didn't stop running until I was outside. The night air was a shock to my senses, but even as I stumbled away from the house, the feeling didn't fade. The weight, the eyes, whatever had been in there was still with me, just behind my back. I didn't know what to do anymore. There were no answers in the journal, no solutions in the warnings I had been given. All I knew was that I had to leave. I had to get away from that house before it took me, too. But as I stood there in the dark, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and steady, following me. I turned around. There was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. The terror I'd felt in that attic hadn't faded. It had followed me, clung to my skin like a phantom. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark shape in the shadows, that thing watching me with its cold, unblinking eyes. Even in the relative safety of the outside world, the weight of it lingered in my chest, suffocating me from the inside. I spent the next day trying to act normal. I forced myself to eat breakfast, shower, and go through the motions of everyday life, as if everything were fine. But nothing felt fine. The house was a prison, and I was its prisoner. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a reminder that whatever was in that house, whatever had been waiting, wasn't finished with me yet. I tried calling a few places, local historians, old town archives, to learn more about the house, but nothing came up. There was no mention of curses, no mention of the occult. Everything was erased, except for one person, Peter. I knew I had to talk to him. He was the only person who seemed to know anything about the house, and if anyone had answers, it was him. I grabbed my jacket and headed over to his place, not giving myself time to second-guess it. His apartment was just down the street, one of those old brick buildings with a faded sign that hung crooked above the door. When I knocked, I was relieved to hear footsteps on the other side. The door opened slowly, and Peter's tired face appeared, looking even more worn than the day before. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "What's wrong?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you. It's about the house." Peter stepped aside, letting me in without a word. His apartment was sparse, much like mine, but there was something comforting in the simplicity of it. It felt grounded, real, in a way that my house never did. I sat on the couch, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "I don't know what's happening, Peter. I've been in that house for barely a week, and it's already," I stopped myself, not knowing how to explain it. Peter sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "It's not just a house, you know. It's more than that. You felt it, didn't you? The way it changes, the way it watches." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "Yes, There's something in there. Something wrong. Peter sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He looked tired, like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. I was hoping you wouldn't have to find out like this. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward. Peter hesitated, looking out the window for a moment before meeting my gaze. That house, it's not just old, and it's not just haunted. It was built for a reason, a dark reason. I swallowed hard, the room suddenly feeling smaller, more suffocating. What reason? He stood up, pacing around the room as he spoke. Edward Crawford didn't just build that house to live in. He built it to summon something. Something that's been locked away for years. The rituals, the invocations he performed, they weren't just games. They were opening doors. Doors that should never have been opened. I shuddered. You mean to say Crawford really did open something? A door to another world. Peter nodded grimly. It's not like what you see in the movies. It's worse. The thing that Crawford unleashed doesn't just stay in one place. It's not bound by time or space. It's a presence. It can follow you, attach itself to you, and over time, it breaks you down. The more you stay in that house, the more it starts to tear at your sanity. I felt my chest tighten. So what happened to the others? The people who lived there before me? Most of them ran, Peter replied, his voice quiet. They left in the middle of the night, never to return. But a few didn't. They were changed, broken. I don't know exactly what happened to them, but I know one thing. You're not the first to hear the footsteps or see the shadows. And you won't be the last. I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words settled on me like a rock, pressing me deeper into the couch. What do I do? I asked, the question coming out in a whisper. Peter turned back to me, his face full of sorrow. You leave. You get out of that house. No matter what. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to pack up everything and walk away, never look back. But something held me there, some twisted sense of obligation, some sense that I needed to finish what I had started. I can't, I said, the words barely escaping my mouth. I can't just leave. There's something in that house, Peter, and I think it wants me. Peter was silent for a moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he said something that froze me to the core. It doesn't just want you. It's already claimed you. The words felt like a slap to the face, but I didn't argue. The truth of it settled over me, suffocating me, and I knew he was right. I had already felt it. The coldness, the whispers, the things that moved in the dark. I had been marked by it, and I didn't know if there was any way to escape. I stood up abruptly, pacing now, my mind racing. There's got to be something I can do, some way to stop it. Peter's voice was quiet, almost regretful. There's nothing you can do. Not alone. That thing, it's ancient, older than the house. Crawford didn't open a door. He made a mistake. And now, it's here. I felt a sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on me, the weight of Peter's words pressing down like a lead blanket. I needed answers. I needed a way out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way out. The sun had begun to set by the time I left Peter's apartment, but the sky was still a dull, hazy gray, like the world itself was caught in some sort of limbo. I couldn't shake the conversation we'd just had. The way Peter had spoken, so sure, so certain about the thing in the house. It left me feeling hollow, as if my own thoughts were being consumed by an unseen force. I knew I had to leave, but as I walked down the street, my feet dragging with every step, I couldn't ignore the pull of that house. It was like a magnet, drawing me back in, telling me that I needed to confront whatever it was that had been lurking there for decades. I didn't want to go back. The thought of stepping foot in that house again filled me with dread, but I couldn't escape it. Not yet. I returned home later that night, the house standing silent in the dark. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows with each gust. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the place I had tried to call home. The familiar creak of the floorboards echoed in the distance, a sound that used to be comforting but now felt menacing. I went inside, locking the door behind me, the silence closing in as soon as I stepped across the threshold. The house felt empty, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me from the shadows. Every flicker of light, every whisper of the wind made my skin crawl. I tried to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The bed felt too small, too confining, as if it were suffocating me. The darkness in the room seemed to stretch out, the corners of the walls pulling inward like the house itself was trying to close in around me. And then the footsteps. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound wasn't in the distance, like it had been before. It was right outside my door. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for them to stop, waiting for the house to settle back into its silence. But they didn't stop. The footsteps moved closer, closer, until they were right outside my door, and then a knock. My blood ran cold. A slow, rhythmic knock on the door, like someone waiting to be let in. I bolted upright, my hands shaking as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand. I turned it on, flooding the room with light, but the knock persisted. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to open the door, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt it, something in the house, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to answer. With trembling hands, I stood up and moved toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. I reached for the handle, my breath shallow, and swung the door open in one quick motion. There was no one there. I blinked in confusion, looking up and down the dark hallway. Empty, silent, but the cold was back. It hit me like a wave, a biting chill that froze me to the bone. The air around me felt thick, dense, like I was wading through fog. I could hear it again, whispers, distant but unmistakable, like 100 voices speaking at once. They were coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. I stepped back, heart racing, feeling the cold creeping into my bones. The door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, but this time the shadows were different. They weren't just stretching across the walls. They were moving, shifting, like they were alive. The shapes were forming, growing darker, denser. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt constricted, as if the very air was turning to lead. I looked toward the staircase, and in the dim light, I saw it, just at the top in the shadows. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible in the darkness. But I could feel it. The presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure moved slowly, methodically, descending the stairs one step at a time, its form shifting and blurring as it came closer. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the house itself was speaking through it. I tried to turn, to run, but it was too late. The figure was standing right in front of me now, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel it pushing me backward, toward the wall. And then I saw it, the face. It was not human. It was twisted, distorted. No eyes, no mouth. Just a mass of shadow and darkness that seemed to warp and shift, like it was made of smoke. I gasped, stumbling back as the figure reached for me, its fingers long and thin, like claws, and for a moment, I thought it would tear me apart. But it didn't. Instead, it simply touched my shoulder. The cold that radiated from it was beyond anything I had ever felt. It seeped into my skin, freezing me in place, freezing me to the core. In that instant I knew. The thing in the house wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't some lingering ghost or lost soul. It was something much worse. It was a thing Crawford had unleashed all those years ago. A being that fed on fear, on pain, on despair. I could feel it now. Inside me. It was feeding on me, slowly draining me. pulling me into the darkness. With a sudden burst of energy, I broke free, stumbling backward toward the door. The thing in the hallway didn't follow. It just watched, its cold gaze fixed on me, the whispers now louder than ever, filling my ears, drowning out all other sound. I didn't know how I made it out of the house that night. I don't remember running or even opening the door. All I know is that when I left everything behind. The house, the darkness, the thing that had claimed me. But as I stood outside in the cold night air, the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, just like they had promised. And when I looked back at the house, I saw it in the window. Those eyes, cold, dark, watching me. It wasn't over. Not yet. I couldn't escape the house. Not entirely. No matter how far I ran, how much I tried to put distance between myself and that place, I knew it was still there, waiting for me, watching me from the shadows. I tried to go back to my normal life, try to act like everything was fine, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They followed me everywhere. In the dead of night, when I tried to sleep, I could hear them scratching at the edges of my mind, pulling me back. They were soft at first, just whispers I could almost ignore. But as the days wore on, they grew louder, more urgent. It was like something inside me was trying to force its way out. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. My work had become a blur. My conversations meaningless. I stopped going outside. I stopped talking to people. The house, the thing in the house, it consumed my every thought. I felt like I was losing myself. And maybe I was. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. There were dreams. Horrible, vivid dreams where I was back in the house. Back in that dark, oppressive space. The figure with no face would be there, waiting in the shadows, always just out of reach. And I would wake up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, gasping for breath. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was pacing my apartment, back and forth, trying to outrun the panic that was clawing at me from the inside. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back. I didn't know why. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was insane, but I had to see it through. I had to understand what it wanted, why it was doing this to me. I grabbed my coat, not even thinking about what I was doing. The streets were empty, the city quiet. But all I could hear were those whispers, growing louder, until they were deafening. They were inside my head now, inside my thoughts, urging me to return. When I arrived at the house, it looked the same, old, decrepit, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. The house wasn't just a house. It was a gateway, a door to something far darker. It was alive, breathing in the night air, waiting. I stood in front of it, my heart racing. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. The cold from the inside seeped out, hitting me like a wall. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the whispers stopped. The silence was even worse. It was like the house had been waiting for me, like it had been holding its breath, and now that I was there, it could finally exhale. The darkness felt more oppressive, more consuming. It was everywhere, inside the walls, the floorboards, the air itself. I could feel it in my chest, pushing against me, suffocating me. I walked through the house, each step echoing loudly in the silence. The shadows were thick here, clinging to every corner, every surface. The familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed to mock me, like the house itself was laughing at my fear. I reached the attic door, and this time, I didn't hesitate. The air in the hallway was colder, more suffocating, like something was waiting for me on the other side. I opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The attic was just as I had left it, but now it felt different. It was darker, more oppressive. The shadows were deeper, swallowing everything in sight. I could feel them closing in around me, tightening their grip. I moved toward the chest, the one Crawford had used for his rituals. The lid was open again, but this time, something was inside. A book. It wasn't the journal I had read before. This one was different, older, bound in something that looked like human skin. The cover was etched with symbols that seemed to shift and move as I looked at them. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I pulled it from the chest. The moment I touched it, the whispers started again, louder now, chaotic, filling my head with 1,000 voices. I opened the book. It wasn't written in any language I could understand. The pages were filled with symbols, drawings of strange, twisted creatures, and rituals that made my stomach turn. I couldn't read it, but I didn't need to. I could feel the power, the darkness radiating from the pages, seeping into my skin. And then I saw it, a drawing of the house. But it wasn't just a drawing. It was a map that showed the hidden chambers beneath the house, the secret rooms where Crawford had performed his rituals, where the door had been opened. I didn't want to go down there, but the map was clear. It showed a passage, a hidden door beneath the floorboards. I could feel it, like a pull in my chest, urging me to follow the path, to uncover what had been hidden for so long. I dropped the book, my heart pounding in my chest, and I moved toward the corner of the attic. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I searched for the hidden door. And there it was, a small crack in the floor, just barely noticeable. I crouched down and pried the boards apart with shaking hands, my heart racing as I uncovered the hidden space beneath. There was a ladder leading down into the darkness. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. The house was pulling me in, and I couldn't fight it anymore. I climbed down the ladder, the darkness swallowing me whole, until the cold was unbearable. The air was thick, stifling, and I could feel something moving in the dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. And then I saw it, a door. It was old, weathered, covered in strange markings that pulsed with a dark energy. The door was locked, but I knew that once I opened it, there would be no turning back. I reached for the handle, and the whispers stopped. The door was silent, waiting for me to open it, as if it had known I would come, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. The air around me was thick with anticipation, suffocating. My hand hovered over the handle, my fingers trembling, the weight of everything I had learned pressing down on me. The map, the rituals, the thing that Crawford had unleashed, everything had led me here to this door. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to step through whatever threshold Crawford had crossed, whatever madness had claimed the house. But I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't turn away now. I twisted the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the darkness, and a cold, rancid air rushed out, hitting me like a physical blow. It smelled like rot, like decay, like something had been trapped inside for far too long. The temperature dropped instantly, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. Beyond the door was a narrow passageway, one that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The walls were made of old, crumbling stone, slick with moisture, and the air was so thick I could taste it. The whispers were gone, but I could still feel the presence, something ancient and powerful, lurking just beyond my reach. I stepped inside, the door shutting behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The floor beneath me was uneven, the stone cold underfoot, and the deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. The path twisted and turned, winding its way through the underground labyrinth. I felt my heartbeat quicken as the air grew heavier, denser, the walls closing in around me. There was a palpable sense of something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every creak of my footsteps felt like a warning, every breath a mistake. I kept going. The passage finally opened into a large, circular room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the stone with disturbing precision. They were the same symbols I had seen in the book, etched in blood and ink, lines that seemed to move and shift as I stared at them. At the center of the room, there was an altar. It was a simple thing, made of rough-hewn stone, but the energy it radiated was anything but simple. I could feel the dark power pulsing from it, a magnetic pull that drew me closer. I didn't want to move toward it, didn't want to give in to the sensation that was tugging at me from the depths of my soul. But I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, my hand reaching out as if it had a mind of its own. The moment my fingers brushed the altar, the ground beneath me trembled. The air grew colder, the walls around me closing in tighter, the stone groaning under an unseen pressure. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly green light, and I could hear something, a low guttural hum, like the sound of something waking up. A crack appeared in the air before me, thin at first, like a tear in reality. I could feel it, a rift, a doorway opening, something pushing through from the other side. And then it spoke, not in words, but in feelings, cold, alien, incomprehensible. A wave of emotion washed over me, rage, despair, hunger. I staggered back, my hands clutching at my head as I tried to block it out, but it was too strong, too real. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The rift was widening now, the space between worlds growing larger, and I could see it, something crawling through, something tall and dark, its form bending and shifting like smoke. It was both there and not there, an impossible thing, made of shadow and something worse, something ancient. I could feel its presence, its hunger, as it emerged into the room. It didn't have a face, not in any way I could recognize, but I could feel its eyes on me, a weight, a pressure that made my chest tighten, my breath shallow. It was watching me, sizing me up, and then it spoke. Mine. The word echoed in my mind, a whisper that felt like a scream. I tried to move, to run, but my body was frozen, caught in the grip of whatever it was that had come through the rift. My vision blurred, my ears ringing as I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but no sound came. It was here, it was real, and it was hungry. I felt its cold hand, if it could be called a hand, brush my face, and the moment it touched me, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the dark chamber beneath the house. I wasn't in the attic or the cold, oppressive hallway. I was somewhere else, somewhere familiar but wrong. The room around me was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of something burning. Old wood, dry paper, the sour scent of decay. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and yellowed, as if the place had been abandoned for decades. But there was something about it, something in the air, that made it feel alive. I stood up, my head spinning, as if I'd just woken from a nightmare. But the reality of it all, the room, the smell, the oppressive feeling in my chest, told me that this was no dream. I wasn't sure how I got here or why, but I knew I wasn't alone. I glanced around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. There were no windows, no doors, just walls that seemed to stretch on forever. A single light flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows on the floor. It was then that I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same sound I had heard before, the sound that had followed me through the house, the noise that had always meant something was near, something was watching. Slowly, I turned toward the corner, and there it was, the figure. It was standing motionless, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. The same tall, shadowy form that had haunted me for days, its presence suffocating, its outline shifting, distorting. It was more tangible now, more solid, yet just as terrifying. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. My body frozen in place, as if the mere act of looking at it was enough to drain the strength from my bones. Then it spoke. Why do you resist? Its voice wasn't a voice at all, but a presence, a thought. It was inside my head, pressing against my mind, twisting my own thoughts until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. The walls pressing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. "You can't escape," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices, all of them murmuring at once. "You've already given yourself to me." I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. No, no, this wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I had to wake up, had to get out of this nightmare. But my body refused to obey. My thoughts were tangled, confused, like I was trapped in a web, unable to escape. The figure stepped forward, the shadows shifting with each movement, enveloping the room in a cold, dense fog. I could feel it getting closer, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. "You are mine," it said again, its words sinking deep into my bones. I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of its power, and I felt my vision blur, the edges of the room darkening. I could feel something inside me, something cold and sharp, like a needle digging into my mind, pulling me further into the darkness. And then suddenly, there was a flash of light, a brilliant, blinding light that cut through the shadows like a knife. The figure recoiled, its form writhing in the light, twisting and contorting as if it were made of smoke. The air seemed to snap like a taut wire, and I felt the pull in my chest, the weight on my lungs, lift for a moment. For the first time since I had entered the house, I could breathe. The light grew stronger, brighter, until the figure was nothing but a shape, a shifting, disfigured blur that seemed to shrink back, retreating into the darkness. I didn't know where the light was coming from. I didn't care. I just knew I had to get out. I had to leave before the shadows came back. But as I moved toward the door, or what I thought was a door, I wasn't sure anymore. The room began to change again. The walls twisted, bending in unnatural angles, like the very space around me was warping. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath me was trying to hold me in place, keeping me trapped. But I pushed forward, my heart pounding, my breath ragged, until I finally reached the door. I grabbed the handle, turning it with frantic desperation, and then the world shifted again. I stumbled backward, disoriented, the door still in my hand, but now I was standing in the attic of the house, the place I had just been moments, hours before. The same dark corners, the same oppressive silence. I couldn't understand. Had I gone in a circle? Was this some kind of twisted dream? And then I saw it. The altar. It was back, standing at the center of the room. The same symbols, the same dark energy pulsing from it. But this time, there was something else. Something new. A shape. A person. It was Crawford. He was standing by the altar, his eyes wide with terror, his body shaking uncontrollably. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if he were trying to scream but couldn't. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. Crawford didn't see me, didn't seem to recognize me. His eyes were fixed on something. Something behind me, something in the shadows. I turned around, and for a brief, horrible moment, I thought I saw it. The thing. It was standing there, just beyond the altar, its dark, shifting form looming in the corner, watching me with those empty, soulless eyes. Its presence was like a weight, crushing me, suffocating me. And then it spoke. Welcome home. The air was thick with dread. It felt like I had crossed some invisible line, like there was no turning back now. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and curling, pulling me deeper into whatever nightmare I had become part of. I could feel the weight of its presence behind me, a suffocating, oppressive force. The thing in the shadows, whatever it was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Crawford's eyes were still wide with fear, his body frozen, his mouth moving soundlessly as if pleading for help that would never come. "Don't look at it," I whispered to myself, but the words felt weak, pointless. I turned back to face the altar, but the symbols carved into the stone were no longer shifting. They were pulsing, glowing with an eerie, sickly green light. The room seemed to vibrate with it, the air thick with the stench of old blood and something worse, something ancient. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I turned to the door, the same door I had just come through, but it was gone. The walls had shifted again, closing in around me, sealing me in this impossible space. "Please, no," I muttered, backing away from the altar. My mind was reeling, my thoughts spinning in a frantic whirl. The thing in the corner had stopped moving, but I could feel it. It was waiting, watching, waiting for me to make my final move. Crawford's mouth was still moving, his eyes darting between me and the thing in the corner. It was as if he were trapped in his own world, stuck in the same nightmare that had ensnared me. I looked around again. There had to be a way out. There had to be. And that's when I saw it. A crack in the wall, just beneath the corner where the shadows seemed to bend and shift. It was small, barely noticeable, but there was something about it. Something that told me it wasn't just a crack. It was a door. Or at least, it could be. It was the only way out. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. My fingers scraped against the rough stone, pulling at the edges of the crack, trying to widen it enough to slip through. I heard a low growl behind me, and I knew, asterisk, that it was a thing coming for me. I pushed harder. The crack widened. I could feel the cold breath of something dark, something ancient, brush against the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I couldn't look at it. Not again. With a final, desperate shove, the crack broke open wide enough for me to slip through. I didn't hesitate. I pushed myself into the small space and squeezed through, my breath catching in my throat as I forced my body into the opening. I tumbled out onto the floor of another room, gasping for air, my heart racing. The space was cramped, narrow, but it felt different. The air wasn't as thick, as heavy. I could breathe again, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel free. The room was small, too small to make sense of, its walls closing in on me just as quickly as the previous room had. But there was something else, something new, something different. A door. It was cracked open just slightly, enough for me to see a sliver of light on the other side. I hesitated, my chest tight, my hands trembling. I couldn't go back. I couldn't face the altar again, couldn't face the thing waiting for me. But I had no choice. I got up, moving toward the door, my breath shallow as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, the metal smooth and slick with some unseen moisture. I twisted it slowly. The door opened. I stepped through, and I was back in the hallway of the house, the very same house. It was the same, familiar, oppressive, but there was something off about it. The air felt thicker here, the house quieter, more empty. The creaking floorboards beneath my feet felt different, too, louder, as if they were protesting my presence, as if they were calling out to something, or someone. I didn't want to stay here. I couldn't stay here, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what else to do. My head was spinning, the room blurring around me, the walls closing in once again. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, measured. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. I knew what it was. It was a thing. It was following me. I had to move. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I just ran down the hallway, into the living room, through the kitchen. The house seemed to stretch on forever, its rooms endless, twisting around me, trapping me in its grip. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare. And then, just as I reached the door of the outside, just as I thought I might escape, I heard it. A whisper. Asterisk mine, asterisk. It wasn't in my ear. It wasn't behind me. It wasn't even inside my head. It was everywhere. It filled the room, the house, my mind. It was in the air, in my blood, in my bones. I turned around, and there it was, the figure, the thing. It was standing at the edge of the doorway, its eyes empty, its form shifting like smoke, like nothing at all. Its presence was unbearable. I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating me. I took a step back, and then another. I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. I looked back at the thing in the doorway. It wasn't moving, not yet, but I could feel it. I could feel it waiting for me to make the final mistake. And then, just as the weight of it threatened to crush me, I heard something. A voice. A familiar voice. It was Crawford. "Run," he screamed. Asterisk run. Asterisk. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, not caring. I just ran. I ran. I couldn't hear my footsteps over the pounding of my heart. The walls around me blurred, like the house itself was warping, bending, twisting as I rushed through it. The hallway stretched endless, like some cruel mockery of a maze. There was no way out. There had to be no way out. But I kept going. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare look back. Though I could feel the thing behind me, that presence pressing closer, its cold breath on my neck. Every time I turned a corner, every time I thought I was escaping, the air grew thicker, heavier. The weight of its presence was crushing. The house was alive, feeding off my fear, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I burst through the living room again, gasping for breath, my chest tight. The windows were black, like mirrors, reflecting nothing but darkness. I couldn't see the sky. I couldn't see the world outside. It was as if the house had swallowed everything, as if I were trapped in a void. And then I saw it, the front door, the one I had tried to escape through earlier. It was wide open now. For a moment I froze. I couldn't understand. How could it be open? Hadn't it been locked? No. I had to get out. This was my chance. This was my only chance. I ran toward the door. I could feel it behind me, closing in. The footsteps were louder now, the heavy tread of something moving with purpose. But I didn't care. I couldn't care. I had to escape. I had to leave. I reached the door, my hand outstretched, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold metal of the doorknob. The door was wide open now, but the space beyond it was not what I expected. It wasn't the outside world. It wasn't sunlight or fresh air or freedom. It was darkness. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this? What was beyond the door? And then I heard it again, a whisper, asterisk, you cannot leave, asterisk. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, quiet, but I could feel it, the thing, the presence. It was there, just beyond my reach, waiting. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. The house was closing in on me. The walls were shifting again, moving, warping, like they were alive. The shadows were stretching toward me, curling around my legs, pulling me into the darkness. I grabbed the doorknob and yanked, but the door didn't budge. It was stuck, as if it were sealed shut from the other side. The harder I pulled, the more the shadows seemed to push against me, squeezing me, suffocating me. I slammed my body against the door, but it wouldn't open. It wouldn't let me out. And then I saw it, the thing, the figure. It was standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. Its form was shifting, melting, its features indistinct, its eyes hollow and black. But its presence, it was everywhere, in the air, in the walls, in my mind. I could feel it closing in around me, wrapping its cold fingers around my chest. It wasn't just behind me. It wasn't just in the shadows. It was inside me now, inside my thoughts, inside my soul. You belong to me, it whispered, and the sound of its voice was like nails on a chalkboard, scratching at my brain. You always have. I staggered back, my head spinning, my vision blurring. The room was shifting again. The walls were closing in, the shadows wrapping tighter and tighter around me. I could feel the cold of its touch, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. It was everywhere, everywhere. And then I heard it. Crawford's voice, shouting, screaming, "Asterisk, get out, asterisk." I looked around, but there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. And then I felt it, the shift, the change, a sound, deep within the house, coming from below me, from the foundation, a rumble, a groan, the sound of something moving, something ancient and alive. The floor beneath me began to tremble, the ground shaking. It felt like the house itself was coming alive, like the walls were breathing, shifting, rearranging themselves. I didn't have time to think. I had to move. I turned and ran again, my feet pounding on the floor, the house shaking beneath me. I could hear it now. The thing moving behind me, its footsteps growing louder, faster. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape, but I couldn't stop. I ran down the hallway, turning corners, rushing through rooms. The house was alive, shifting, changing, closing in on me with every step. I couldn't see the way forward. I couldn't see the way out. It was all a blur, all a maze, all a trap. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A staircase. I ran toward it, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The staircase was old, wooden, creaking under my feet, but it led up, away from the suffocating darkness below. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached the top of the stairs, gasping for air, my legs weak beneath me. The house was silent now. The footsteps were gone. The shadows were still. But I knew it was waiting. I knew it was coming. And then, from behind me, I heard it again. The whisper. Asterisk mine, asterisk. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I ran. I didn't know where I was anymore. I'd run through what felt like endless rooms, down endless hallways, up and down stairs, but it was all the same. The house was alive, shifting and bending around me, its walls stretching like something that had no beginning or end. It was a maze, a nightmare, and no matter how fast I moved, no matter how many corners I turned, the thing was still behind me. I could feel it, always. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, every breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My legs ached, my body trembling from the exhaustion, the fear, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. I reached the top of the stairs and turned into another hallway. This one was different. It was familiar, but not. The wallpaper was peeling here. The once colorful floral pattern faded to a dull, sickly yellow. The light in the hallway flickered intermittently, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air smelled stale, like old dust and mildew. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my fingers brushing the frame as I reached out for it. The door creaked as I pulled it open, and I stumbled inside. It was a bedroom. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house. The air was damp, thick with the scent of rot, and the bed was covered in dust, the sheets tattered and old. The walls were adorned with strange symbols. Symbols I recognized from the journal, from the rituals I had read about. Symbols I had seen before in the dark corners of the house, in the places where the thing lived. I couldn't breathe. The weight of it, the house, the thing, the darkness, pressed down on me, suffocating me, pushing me into the corner of the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I could hear it, those footsteps again. They were heavy, slow, purposeful. I turned, my heart racing. It was in the room with me now. I didn't know how it had gotten in. I didn't know how it could be here, but I could feel it. Its presence, its coldness, its darkness. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the floor, my hands pressed against the wall. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The room was small, the walls closing in on me, the shadows stretching further, reaching for me, curling around my body like tendrils. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, just leave me alone." But the thing didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was already inside me, inside my thoughts, my mind. It was part of the house. It was part of everything. I could hear it now. Its voice, low and guttural, whispering in my mind. "You are mine." I clutched my head in my hands, the words drilling into my skull. It was getting worse. The walls of the room were warping, the floor twisting beneath my feet. I could hear the air crackling like static, like a radio signal breaking through the static, getting louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And then, through the noise, I heard another sound. A voice. A human voice. Asterisk, get out. Asterisk. I jerked my head up, my heart leaping in my chest. I knew that voice. I recognized it. It was Crawford. I spun around, but he wasn't there. The room was empty, except for me and the thing. The shadows began to shift, forming something more solid, something real. The figure. It was standing there, right in front of me, its outline barely visible in the dim light, its eyes empty and black. "You are mine," it repeated. Its voice was stronger now, more forceful. "And you will never leave." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my mind screaming, begging for escape, but there was nothing. There was nowhere to go. The shadows grew, stretching, twisting around me, pulling me in. I could feel them crawling over my skin, cold and damp, like fingers dragging me into the darkness. I could feel the weight of it, the curse of this house, bearing down on me. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but it was gone. The hallway was gone. The whole house was gone. I was in a void now, a place without form, without light, without escape. And then, for the briefest moment, there was silence. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. It reached for me, and as its hand brushed against my skin, I felt a shock, a surge of cold, a rush of something ancient, something powerful. It was pulling me into it, drawing me closer, consuming me. Asterisk, you belong to me, asterisk. And then everything went dark. Story 2. The boxes were everywhere. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked cardboard boxes that seemed to stretch on forever. My breath came out in short bursts, the air thick with dust. The house was quiet, too quiet. For a moment, I wondered if I had made the right choice. The house was old, ancient really, nestled at the edge of town. It had that charming, dilapidated look that seemed to pull at me when I first saw it. The kind of place you imagine stories happening in, with creaky floors and tall windows that catch the last light of the setting sun. The realtor had told me it had been empty for years. The price had been reasonable, too reasonable. But after the divorce, I didn't care. I just needed somewhere new, somewhere far from the reminders of my old life. The house was perfect. The first day had been exhausting. I had hired a moving company, but most of my things were small enough to carry in by myself. The furniture was basic, nothing fancy. I had my kitchen table set up and a couch that was more comfortable than stylish. Still, there was something oddly reassuring about the space. It felt mine. By the time night fell, I was already half asleep on the couch, my body aching from the move. The house was completely still. It was a feeling I wasn't used to. After years of living in a bustling city, surrounded by noise and constant activity, this silence was unsettling. There was no hum of traffic, no distant chatter, just a faint creak of the house settling. I pulled the blanket around me tighter, telling myself it was just the sound of an old house getting comfortable. It had character, that's all. But then I heard it, a sound, soft at first, like the sound of someone walking across the floor, but slow and deliberate. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up quickly, my heart skipping a beat. I listened carefully, but the sound stopped. For a moment, I wondered if it had been a dream. Maybe I had imagined it. The house was old and old houses creaked. I shook my head, lying back down. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but as I closed my eyes again, the sound came back. The footsteps, louder this time, coming from upstairs. I shot up, my pulse racing. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was an animal. There was a fireplace, and I knew critters sometimes found their way into places like this. But no, these were footsteps, human footsteps. Slow, heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth on the second floor. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the house settling, right? Houses make noise, even if they're empty. Maybe it was the wind pushing against the old wood, making it groan and creak. But no, this wasn't the wind. The footsteps were deliberate, as if someone was walking on purpose. I stood up from the couch, my body tense. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I tiptoed toward the stairs, holding my breath. I peered up into the dark hallway. The house felt colder now, a strange chill settling in the air. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning every corner. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I should have just gone back to the couch. I should have ignored it and tried to sleep. But curiosity gnawed at me. I had to check. I made my way up the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the house, feeling louder than it should have been. At the top, I reached a long hallway that led to the bedrooms. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no sounds at all. I stood there for a moment, my breath steadying. The hallway stretched before me, dark and seemingly endless, as if it were waiting. I glanced into the first room on the right. It was the guest bedroom, empty, save for a few dusty boxes. I moved on, slowly, toward the next room. That's when I saw it, a faint shadow, just past the doorframe at the end of the hall. I froze. For a moment, it was as if the air itself had thickened. I could barely breathe. The shadow was gone before I could even process it, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stepped forward, my hand on the doorknob. Nothing, just the usual empty room. I stood in the doorway for a long time, the unease growing with every passing second. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. I couldn't let myself get wrapped up in this nonsense. I backed away from the room, slowly, and turned to head back down the stairs. But that's when I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they were closer. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Empty hallway. My breath was shallow, panic starting to claw at my throat. There was nothing there. I was just being paranoid, right? I bolted down the stairs and back to the living room. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands trembling as I dialed a number for a locksmith. The door was locked. The house was locked. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I knew in that moment that this house was not like the others I'd lived in. There was something in the walls, something waiting, but I wasn't going to leave. Not yet. I couldn't. This was my new life, and I would make it work. Whatever this house was, I could handle it. I just had to keep telling myself that. But as I turned off the lights and settled back onto the couch, I couldn't ignore the sound of footsteps once again. And this time they didn't stop. The morning came too quickly. The early light filtered in through the gaps in the curtains, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. My sleep had been restless, my dreams filled with strange noises and flickering lights. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the feeling that something was still watching me. I couldn't explain it. It was like the house had a pulse, a strange rhythm that echoed through the walls at all hours of the night. But it wasn't just the noises. It was a silence, too. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like you're not alone. The kind of silence that makes you question your own thoughts. I sat up on the couch, feeling the ache in my back from the uncomfortable night's rest. The house was still, too still. The kind of stillness that made the floorboards creak more than usual, that made every sound outside seem louder. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, but it didn't feel like a normal breeze. It felt wrong, like the air itself was thickening, pressing in on me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. I had to get to work. It was a small office job I had taken just to pay the bills. Nothing special. But I needed the routine, the distraction. I had to force myself to stop thinking about the house. The house. The footsteps. I shook my head. No, I wasn't going to let it consume me. I just had to get through the day. I dressed quickly, my mind still not fully awake, and grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter. As I stepped out the door and onto the porch, I noticed a woman standing across the street, leaning against a fence. She was older than me, her hair gray but pulled back neatly into a ponytail. She wore a long coat, and despite the chill in the morning air, she didn't seem to be in a hurry to leave. She caught my eye and waved. I hesitated, unsure whether I should approach her or keep walking, but she was already moving toward me, her steps deliberate, almost as if she had been waiting for me to notice her. "Hi there," she said with a smile, her voice friendly but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "You're the new tenant, right? The one who moved into the old house." I nodded, a bit taken aback by her sudden approach. "Yeah, that's me. Just moved in yesterday." "I thought so," she said, her eyes lingering on the house behind me. "It's been a while since anyone's lived there." I frowned. "Is that so?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past me, her gaze fixed on the house with an almost wistful expression. "People come and go," she said quietly. "That house, well, it has a way of driving people off." I felt a chill crawl down my spine, despite the warmth of the sun on my back. "What do you mean?" The woman glanced at me, her eyes sharp now. "You didn't hear about the last tenants? The ones before you?" I shook my head. "No, I didn't. They didn't last long," she said, her voice lowering as if she was sharing a secret. "The woman who lived there before you, she ran out one night, crying and babbling about curses. Said something was in the house. Hey, presence. People thought she was just going through a rough time. But when she left, she didn't come back. No one has stayed in that house for more than a few months." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "And what about the people before her?" I asked, my voice a little shakier than I intended. The woman didn't answer at first. She seemed lost in thought, as though she was remembering something dark. Then, her gaze returned to me, more intense now. "There's always something. People hear things, footsteps, whispers. Some say it's just a house settling. But I think something else is going on. I've lived here long enough to know when a place isn't right." I swallowed hard. "So, you think the house is haunted?" She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched me. Her eyes were hard to read, but there was something in them, something that made my stomach twist. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe not, but you'll see for yourself soon enough. Just be careful. There's a history there. People like to forget it, but it's not something you can escape." I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. My mind was spinning with the words she had just said. Haunted? A curse? The woman seemed kind, but the way she spoke, so certain, so knowing, made the unease I'd felt since moving and bubble up again. "Thanks for the warning," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know if I believed her, but the look in her eyes told me that she wasn't just trying to scare me. She gave me a small, knowing smile, then turned and walked away without another word. I stood there for a moment, watching her disappear around the corner of the street. I wanted to dismiss everything she had said, to convince myself it was just small-town gossip. But something in the way she had spoken stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I drove to work, the events of the morning clung to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been given a warning, something that I hadn't been ready to hear. The house, the footsteps, the whispers. Was it all just my imagination, or was there really something more to it? I didn't know what to think anymore, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the rearview mirror every now and then, half expecting to see the house looming behind me. The house on Maple Street. The office felt like a lifeline. For the first time in days, I could focus on something other than the creeping unease that had taken root in my mind. The routine of work, small, mundane tasks. Typing away at the keyboard, answering the phone, was a welcome distraction. It was easier to forget about the house, the footsteps, and the warnings from my strange neighbor when I was buried in a mountain of paperwork. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the thought of that house lingered, like a shadow just out of reach. Every time I glanced out the office window, I found my thoughts drifting back to it. The old house on Maple Street, standing silent and still in the distance, as though it were watching me. By the time the workday ended, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. My mind felt foggy, and all I wanted was to go home, eat something quick, and collapse onto the couch. But even as I walked to my car, the air around me seemed thick with tension. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I didn't like the way the light changed in this town. It made everything look strange, unfamiliar. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. It was just a change in seasons, nothing more. The light was fading earlier, and that always made things feel off. Nothing to worry about. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced over my shoulder and my stomach dropped. The house was there, standing just beyond the edge of town. Its silhouette was black against the fading light, its windows like hollow eyes, staring into the distance. I turned the steering wheel sharply, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly as I sped toward home. I couldn't help it. It felt like the house was waiting for me, pulling me back. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to shake it off, to laugh at myself for being so paranoid. But when I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't ignore the strange sensation that crept over me. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if it had been holding its breath all day, waiting for my return. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. I should have gone straight inside, but instead, I found myself staring at the porch, at the dark windows. It was then that I noticed something new, something I hadn't seen before. The porch light, which had been flickering on and off since I moved in, was now completely dark. The bulb had burned out, or at least that's what I assumed. But something about it felt deliberate, like the house was waiting for something. The feeling of being watched washed over me again. I couldn't explain it, but it was unmistakable. My skin prickled, and I had to force myself out of the car. The house seemed to breathe, its silence pressing in on me. I grabbed my things, slammed the car door shut, and hurried inside, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. As I entered the living room, I noticed that it was colder than usual. The air had a strange quality to it, as if it wasn't just temperature. Something about it felt wrong. I shivered and went to the thermostat, but it was set at a reasonable temperature. It didn't make sense. The house had always been chilly, but tonight it felt as though the cold was seeping through the walls. I stood there for a moment, staring at the thermostat, trying to make sense of it all. Was it just the house settling again? Or was there something more? A faint noise, like the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, broke my concentration. It came from upstairs. I froze. I had been alone all day. I had locked the door behind me when I left for work. There was no reason for anyone to be up there. I slowly turned and walked toward the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. My breath came in short gasps as I climbed each step, the air growing colder with every movement. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, straining to listen. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The house was old. Old houses made noises. It had probably been the wind, or maybe just the pipes. But the sound had been clear, unmistakable. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached the first bedroom, I paused, glancing inside. Everything seemed in order. The door to the second room was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it that way, but maybe I had. I pushed the door open cautiously, but once again, the room was empty. It wasn't until I reached the third room that I felt it. The air was thick, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on my arm stand up. The door to the attic was ajar, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows inside the room. I hadn't opened that door since the night I found the journal. But now, it seemed to beckon me. Something about it felt different, more insistent. I moved toward it slowly, as though something might stop me if I went too fast. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing, but there was a presence in the room, a quiet pressure that filled the space. I reached for the door, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. There, on the floor, just below the attic stairs, was a chair. A wooden rocking chair that wasn't there the last time I checked. It was rocking, by itself. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The room seemed to tilt, as though the air around me had become thick and heavy, pushing against me. The chair stopped rocking, but the feeling of being watched, of something moving just out of sight, didn't. I backed away, my legs weak beneath me, my breath shallow and fast. That was when I heard it, a whisper, soft, so quiet I almost missed it. "Stay." I slammed the door shut and rushed back downstairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. The house was not just a house. It was something else, something that wanted me here. And now, it wasn't letting me go. I didn't sleep that night. The rocking chair was all I could think about. The way it had moved on its own, the whispered word that had followed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the house, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracks in the walls felt like a warning. I stayed awake for hours, the cold seeping into my bones as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I hadn't wanted to go back into that room. I had hoped that the strange events would just stop, that it was all in my head. Stress from the move, the divorce, the adjustment to the strange new place. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew something had changed in the house, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. The next morning, I couldn't bear to stay in bed any longer. I knew I had to find answers, something to make sense of the dread that seemed to fill every corner of the house. The journal, the one I had found in the attic, tucked away in a dusty box, was the only thing that might hold the answers. I hadn't opened it fully the night I found it. In my panic, I had just grabbed it and shoved it into a drawer, thinking it might be nothing but some old scrap of someone's forgotten memories. But now, it felt different. It felt like it held something important, something I needed to understand if I was going to stay in this house without losing my mind. I retrieved the journal from the drawer and sat down at the kitchen table. The letter was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. It didn't look like anything special, just a small, unremarkable book. But I could feel its weight, as though it carried something more than just ink and paper. I opened the first page, and the handwriting immediately struck me. It was hurried, scrawled in a way that suggested panic or fear. The words seemed almost desperate, each one bleeding into the next as though the writer couldn't get them down fast enough. September 12th, 1923. Asterisk, I can feel it watching me again. It's here. I don't know how long I've been here, but it's been too long. The house calls to me, even in my sleep. It whispers my name, pulls at me from the walls. I can hear it breathing. I can hear it moving. It won't let me leave. Asterisk. I paused, my stomach twisting in knots. I had no idea what I was expecting to read, but it certainly wasn't this. I turned the page, hoping for something more coherent, something that would make sense of the madness. October 5th, 1923. Asterisk, the door is opening. The door to the room at the end of the hall. It's been locked for years, but now it calls to me. I can't resist it. I've seen the shape behind the door. I've seen its eyes. It's waiting for me, asterisk. I shut the journal for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The room at the end of the hall. I knew which room it was. The one that had felt the strangest to me. The one I had avoided since moving in. The one with the door that was always slightly ajar. I felt a chill run through me, but I forced myself to open the journal again. October 18th, 1923. Asterisk, I found the ritual. It's in the walls. The house has a history, a curse, and I think it was always here. I've tried to get out, but every time I turn around, I hear its footsteps. It's coming for me. I can feel it in my bones, asterisk. The words blurred as my vision began to swim. I felt nauseous, like I was on the verge of something terrible. The journal didn't just describe an old house. It described this house. The one I had moved into. The one I had thought was just another worn-down property. But now, reading these words, I could see it for what it truly was. A place that held something darker than I had imagined. I flipped through the pages frantically, searching for anything that might explain what was happening to me. And then, towards the end, I found something that made my blood run cold. November 7th, 1923. Asterisk, I've seen it again. The thing in the attic. It's waiting. I've heard the footsteps, heavy, slow. The chair moves on its own, the same as before. I think it's watching me. It knows I'm close, that I'm looking for the door. The ritual must be completed. The door must be open, asterisk. I stopped reading. My breath caught in my throat. The thing in the attic. The rocking chair. It was all connected. The footsteps, the whispers. This was no coincidence. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been in the walls for decades, had never truly left. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the very space around me was pressing down. It was suffocating. I wanted to leave. I wanted to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. Something inside me, some strange compulsion, told me that I couldn't leave without facing whatever was in this house. The thing that had been here long before I ever set foot in this place. I had to know what it wanted. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and made my way toward the stairs. Every creak of the floorboard seemed louder than the last, each step a reminder of the weight I was carrying. The journal was heavy in my hand, and the memories of the words of the terror described in its pages made my heart race. I reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the door to the attic, the same door that had been ajar when I first found it. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the door felt like a barrier, a boundary that I wasn't sure I should cross. But I had to. I had to see what was waiting behind it, what had been left behind by the house's previous tenants. I took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob, and then I heard it again, the footsteps, the slow, heavy steps moving toward me from the dark hallway. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was coming. Something was coming for me, and I had no idea how to stop it. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my pulse racing. The footsteps were getting closer, louder, heavier, like someone was slowly moving down the hallway toward me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but the air felt thick, suffocating. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, my mind racing with terror and disbelief. I had to move. I had to open that door. With trembling fingers, I twisted the knob, the old wood creaking under the pressure. The door opened slowly, almost as if it were reluctant to allow me entry. I could feel the cold air spilling out from the attic, a chill that wrapped around me like ice. I stepped into the narrow stairway, each step echoing in the silence as I climbed up to the attic. The house seemed to be holding its breath, and I could almost hear the heartbeat of the walls around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I reached the top, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The attic was just as I remembered it. Dusty, cluttered with forgotten belongings and bathed in shadows. But now, in the stillness of the night, it felt different, more alive, as though something in the room had been waiting for me to arrive. I took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My eyes scanned the room, lingering on the corners, the old furniture covered in white sheets. But it was the farthest corner that caught my attention, the one where the rocking chair sat, motionless in the gloom. I froze. The chair. It was still. For a moment, I almost allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. But then, something caught my eye, something that made my heart skip a beat. The floorboards around the chair were disturbed. It was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. The marks in the dust, the faint impression of something being dragged across the floor. I stepped closer, feeling my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a chair. It was a symbol. A faint, uneven circle was etched into the wooden floorboards. At first, I thought it might have been a stain, something that had been left behind by time. But as I crouched down to get a better look, I realized that the symbol was deliberate, carefully carved, worn by years of dust and neglect. A circle, surrounded by jagged lines, leading to a central point. It looked almost like some kind of ritualistic pattern. My stomach turned as I recognized what I was looking at. The same kind of symbol I had seen in the journal. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I wasn't sure I could, but I had no doubt now. This house was tied to something dark, something ancient, and the ritual that had been referenced in the journal wasn't just some old story. It was real. The footsteps. I snapped my head up, my heart racing again. The footsteps were back, closer now, right behind me. I didn't need to look. I could feel it. Whatever it was here. The air was heavy with its presence. It was in the room with me, just out of sight, moving closer, its cold breath on my neck. I couldn't stay here. I turned to run, but as I moved toward the stairs, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The door had locked itself. I was trapped. I hammered on the door, but the wood held firm. The room seemed to grow darker, the air colder, and the whispering began again, soft, unintelligible, like voices coming from all directions. It was the same voice I had heard before, the one that had whispered, "Stay." The shadows in the attic seemed to shift, coiling around me. I could hear them moving, crawling, slithering just out of my sight. I backed away from the door, my mind spiraling into panic. And then I saw it. In the corner of the attic, beneath a thick layer of dust, there was a small old chest. The wood was darkened with age, the edges worn and chipped. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to call to me. I didn't know why, but I knew. I had to open it. I stumbled toward the chest, my hands shaking as I crouched down. The whispering grew louder now, a chorus of voices, urgent and insistent. I didn't know what I was doing, but something inside me compelled me to open the chest. With a sharp breath, I lifted the heavy lid. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers. Dozens of them, stacked haphazardly, some of them torn, some of them folded. I grabbed the top sheet and unfurled it. The writing was faint, but I could make out the words. Asterisk, the door is open. It cannot be closed. There is no escape. They are here, asterisk. I stumbled back, dropping the paper as I heard a low, guttural growl from behind me. I turned. It was standing there, a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows, its body wrapped in a cloak of darkness. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though the very fabric of reality was bending and warping in its presence. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were black voids, endless and consuming, pulling me in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, by the sheer presence of whatever this thing was. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. It was all around me now, in my ears, in my mind. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was in my head, inside my very soul, and I felt it, felt the coldness, the darkness, creeping in around me. The thing moved closer, its presence overwhelming. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in on me. And then in a final, desperate rush, the thing reached out, its cold fingers brushing my skin. Everything went black. I don't remember what happened after that, but when I awoke, I was alone again, and the house was silent. I woke up on the floor, cold and trembling, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The attic was as it had always been, dusty, cluttered, and still, but the air felt different, as though the oppressive weight of something terrible had lifted, if only for a moment. I couldn't remember how long I'd been unconscious. Time felt warped, stretching and bending like the walls around me. I could still hear the whispers echoing faintly in my head, but they were distant now, like a fading nightmare. But the feeling of being watched, it never left. I sat up slowly, my limbs heavy and uncooperative, and glanced around the attic. The chest I had opened was still there, its lid half open, revealing the crumpled papers I had discarded in my panic. I didn't want to touch them. I didn't want to look at them. But some part of me knew that I couldn't leave without understanding what I had uncovered. Reluctantly, I crawled over to the chest and pulled the top paper free. The words blurred as I scanned them, the meaning lost in the fog of my fear. Asterisk there waiting. You are the last. You must open the door, or you will join us forever, asterisk. I shoved the paper away, my heart racing. The door the journal had spoken of, the one that had been locked for years, the one that was never meant to be opened, the door to the other side. I could feel the house stirring around me, as though it were alive, as though it were breathing. The walls seemed to hum with a quiet, unnatural energy, and I could hear the faintest tapping, like nails against wood, from somewhere deep within the structure. I was running out of time. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady as I made my way toward the attic stairs. The house creaked beneath me with every step, its sighs of age echoing through the empty halls. The house felt more alive now, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The oppressive stillness had returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was waiting, watching. I reached the top of the stairs, and for the first time since moving in, I found myself standing before the door at the end of the hallway, the door that had always been slightly ajar, the door I had avoided for days. Now, there was no more avoiding. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The cold metal burned my skin as my fingers closed around it. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The journal, the whispers, the footsteps, it was all leading here. I had no choice. I had to open it. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. It wasn't like I expected. The room beyond was not some dark, forgotten space filled with cobwebs and dust. No! It was far worse than that. It was alive. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood, their edges glowing faintly with an eerie, greenish light. The air inside the room was thick, like the fog before a storm, swirling with a strange energy that made my head spin. The floor was uneven, and in the center of the room stood an altar, made of stone, dark and slick with something that looked too much like blood. And on the altar was a book, a large ancient tome, bound in what looked like human skin, its pages curled and yellowed with age. The book seemed to pulse, its dark presence thrumming in the air around me. I could feel it, tugging at my mind, beckoning me closer. I took a step forward, my feet moving almost of their own accord. The door behind me slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house, and I whirled around, panic flooding my chest. There was no way out now, no way to turn back. I reached the altar, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the book. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, the temperature dropped, and I heard the whispers again, louder, more insistent. They were all around me, filling my head with voices. You shouldn't have come. The book opened on its own, as if it had been waiting for me to open it. The pages turned with a life of their own, the ink on the paper swirling and shifting before my eyes, forming words in a language I couldn't understand. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the words, but the more I stared, the more the symbols seemed to burn into my eyes, like they were searing themselves into my very soul. And then I saw it, a drawing, scratched hastily into the page, a dark figure, tall and thin, cloaked in shadow. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, black endless pits, stared back at me, as though it were watching me through the pages. And beneath it, written in the same indecipherable script, was one word. Help! I recoiled, stumbling back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't just a book. It was a curse. It was a call. I had no time to think. My heart was pounding in my chest as I spun around, desperately trying to find an exit. But the room had shifted. The walls were closing in, the symbols on the walls now pulsating with dark light, a low hum vibrating through the floor. The air was so thick with malevolent energy that I could barely breathe. And then, as if answering some unspoken command, the door to the room opened, but it wasn't the hallway I had left behind. It was a black void, an endless darkness, stretching out before me, pulling me in. I didn't know what was on the other side. I didn't care. I turned and ran. The whispers followed me, the cold breath on my neck. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting me go. I had to get out, but as I reached the stairs, something stopped me. It was a feeling of eyes on me, eyes from the dark, eyes from the shadows, watching, waiting. I didn't want to look back, but I did. I shouldn't have looked. The moment my gaze fell back toward the darkened doorway, I saw them, eyes, staring from the void like cold, empty sockets, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They weren't human. They weren't even alive. But they were there, and they were aware. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. The eyes were all I could see, endless and black, like an abyss waiting to swallow me whole. My mind screamed for me to run, to turn away, to forget everything I had just seen, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away from that unblinking gaze. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free, but I couldn't. A low, guttural sound echoed from the dark doorway. The sound of something moving, something shifting in the void. The shadows around the eyes thickened, swirling like smoke, and then a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretching and warping as it took shape. The thing was covered in shadow, its body indistinct, but the eyes, those black endless pits, grew larger, more intense, until I could feel them burrowing into my soul. The figure was slowly moving toward me, and I could hear the soft scraping of something against the floor, a slow, deliberate drag of something heavy. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The only noise in the room was the rhythmic thumping of my heart, each beat louder than the last. My vision started to blur, and for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. But no, this was real. It had to be. The figure was getting closer now, and with it came a suffocating coldness. It wrapped around me like an icy fog, seeping into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. The whispers grew louder again, more frantic, more desperate. But this time, they were clear. Asterisk, it's too late. You cannot escape. It has seen you, asterisk. The words echoed through my mind, drowning out everything else. My legs finally gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands scrambling for something to hold on to. But the room was spinning, the walls warping, and the only thing I could focus on was the darkness moving toward me. I reached out, my fingertips grazing the floor, searching for anything to stop the inevitable. But all I felt was the cold, and then the floor beneath me gave way. I tumbled into darkness, falling through the black void that had opened up beneath me. For a moment, I thought I was gone, lost to whatever had been waiting for me in the house. But then, with a sudden jarring shift, I hit the ground hard. I gasped for air, my chest aching, my body sore. My eyes snapped open, but the darkness around me was still overwhelming. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't feel anything. I was suspended in a cold, empty space. A place where time didn't exist, where the only thing that mattered was a sense of being. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispers were still in my head, louder now, suffocating. The sensation of eyes on me was overwhelming, crawling over my skin like 1,000 invisible hands. Then I heard it, a voice, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each passing second. You should have stayed away. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was more of a presence, a force that pressed against my mind, sending waves of nausea through me. I wanted to claw at my head, to make it stop, but I couldn't. My hands wouldn't move. We are everywhere. The voice twisted, bending and warping, taking on 1,000 different tones. It was as if it was speaking from every direction at once, from every corner of the room, from every crack in the walls. Asterisk, you cannot leave. You are already ours, asterisk. The words hit me like a physical blow, rattling my bones, and in that moment I understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It had always been alive, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who had lived within its walls. And now, it had me. I felt the presence pressing in from all sides, a suffocating weight that crushed me. I could feel the cold hands of whatever was in the darkness reaching for me, brushing against my skin like icy fingers. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The darkness receded, and I was left gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. I wasn't in the attic anymore. I wasn't even in the house. I was somewhere else, somewhere worse. I was standing in a vast, empty space. No walls, no ceiling, just an endless expanse of blackness that stretched out in all directions. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I wasn't alone. There, standing before me in the black void, was the figure again. The same tall, shadowed figure with the dark, empty eyes. It was watching me, and I knew without a doubt that it was waiting for me to make a choice. I had no choice. I never had. The figure stood there, as tall and as imposing as before. Its eyes, the deep, abyssal voids, fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers through my entire being. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs were frozen in place. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the room pressing in on me, crushing me from all sides. I didn't know how long I had been standing there. Time had no meaning in this space. It was like I had been ripped from everything I knew, thrust into some nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. And the figure, it was waiting for me to understand. You should have stayed away. The words echoed in my head, a haunting refrain that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was as though the figure was inside my mind, speaking directly to my thoughts, probing the deepest corners of my fears. The whispers from before had stopped, replaced by a heavy, unearthly silence that stretched on for eternity. The silence was worse, far worse than the whispers. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mouth tasting like metal. I could feel the pulse of my heart in my ears, each beat a frantic drum, a warning. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be a way back. There is no escape. The voice again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the chilling, disembodied whisper I had heard before. This time, the voice was clearer, more defined, like it was speaking directly from the darkness, from the figure. It was an invitation, a command, a promise. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My tongue felt thick, as though it were coated in cement, unable to form anything coherent. My eyes stayed locked on the figure, unable to break free of its gaze. I could feel it, its presence wrapping around me, coiling through my chest, constricting my ribs, suffocating me. You have already made the choice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight it, to break free from the pull, but I couldn't. My body was no longer my own. My mind felt like it was slipping, like I was being pulled into some kind of abyss where nothing mattered anymore. The figure began to move toward me, slowly at first, but then with a quick, unnatural fluidity. Each step it took seemed to make the air around me grow heavier, thicker. The shadows around it stretched longer, twisting like serpents, wrapping themselves around the ground beneath us. I backed up, my feet stumbling, but the void behind me gave way to nothing. There was no wall to push against. There was no ground to stand on. The figure was closing in, its black eyes unblinking, relentless. I had no choice. I opened my mouth, but the words were drowned by a rising pressure in my chest. It felt like the darkness was flooding my body, like it was pouring in through my skin, filling every crevice of my mind, drowning everything in its wake. You are already ours. The words crashed through me like a tidal wave, and suddenly I understood. The house wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, a creature born from suffering and fear, from the souls of those who had been trapped within it. And now, it had me. The figure was so close now, its dark shape looming over me like a nightmare made flesh. I could feel the coldness of its presence pressing against my skin, like it was seeping into my very bones. My breath caught in my throat as its hands reached out, long, skeletal fingers brushing my arm. And then, without warning, the darkness around me shifted. I was no longer in the void. I was back in the house. The walls were familiar, yet they felt different now, distorted, warped. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, and I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but the figure was gone. The cold was gone. The room around me was empty. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, but then I realized it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The house was still alive, and it was waiting for me to make my final decision. I moved through the hallway, my feet moving on their own, each step echoing in the silence. The house seemed to shift around me, its walls narrowing, the shadows growing longer. I could feel the presence behind me, the weight of its gaze pressing on my back. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the house. The door at the end of the hallway was open. I didn't want to go through it. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting on the other side. But something inside me knew I had no choice. I walked toward the door, my mind screaming for me to stop, but my body kept moving. As I stepped over the threshold, the temperature dropped and the familiar scent of decay and dust filled my nostrils. But this time, the room was different. It wasn't empty. In the center of the room stood the altar. The same altar I had seen in the attic, but it was no longer just a stone slab. It was covered in symbols, dark, twisted markings that seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them. The air was thick with energy, with power. And the book was open again, its pages fluttering as though something were turning them of its own accord. I could feel it. It was here. It was in the room with me. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices filling my head, drowning out everything else. The figure appeared in the doorway, its eyes fixed on me. I knew what it wanted. It was waiting for me to join it, to become a part of the house's curse, to feed the darkness that had consumed everything before me. I closed my eyes, and in that moment I understood there was no way out. There had never been, and I was already lost. It was too late to escape. I knew that now. The weight of the room pressed down on me, heavier than ever before. The whispers curled around my thoughts, wrapping themselves like tight cords, suffocating any chance of clarity. The figure in the doorway was watching, waiting, and with each passing second, I could feel it, its presence growing, like an insidious tide creeping up my legs, pulling me deeper into the dark abyss. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The house, no. This thing, it had me. It had always had me, even before I had ever stepped foot inside its cursed walls. Every corner of this place was an extension of its hunger. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the shadows, an invitation to its grasp. And now, I had no choice but to surrender. The air around me seemed to grow thick with a strange, inescapable pressure. The symbols on the walls began to glow, their lines twisting, shifting like living things, and the cold and unnatural, soul-chilling cold settled deep into my bones. I felt it now, more than I had ever felt it before. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the sensation of something crawling under my skin, like it was seeping into my very being. The book on the altar, that accursed tome, opened wider as I stepped closer. Its pages fluttered, the sound like the beating of 1,000 wings, and the symbols on the pages shifted as if alive. I could almost hear them, the words whispering directly into my mind, filling it with promises of something I couldn't comprehend. Join us. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from it, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt like I was trapped in my own skin, watching from the inside as the darkness moved closer. A cold hand, long, bony, with fingers like twisted branches, brushed against my shoulder. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. I could feel the presence behind me, its eyes boring into my back, its breath cold against the nape of my neck. The house, the thing in the house, was inside me now. You have been chosen. The voice was clearer now, no longer a whisper but a deep, resonant tone, like it was speaking from the very walls, from the floor beneath my feet. It was a voice that made the blood freeze in my veins, a voice that demanded something from me, something I could never give. I stumbled back, my feet dragging, but the room around me closed in. The walls seemed to pulse with each breath I took, each heartbeat, as if the house itself was alive, asterisk breathing asterisk with me. The darkness had its claws in me, and I could feel it pulling me toward the altar, toward that damnable book. I had to touch it. I had to understand it. It was the only way to break free, or so my mind told me. But as my hand hovered over the book, a chilling thought struck me. What if there was no breaking free? What if this place, this curse, was something much older than I could ever comprehend? What if everything I had experienced was just a part of a long, terrible cycle, and I was merely the latest to be swept into its grasp? I didn't know how long I stood there, my hand trembling above the book, before I finally let it fall. The moment my fingers touched the pages, the room went silent. The oppressive pressure vanished, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I had escaped. I thought I had won, but then I felt it. The floor beneath me shifted, tilting as if the house itself was groaning under the weight of its own existence. I looked down, and the ground seemed to ripple beneath me, the wooden floorboards warping and twisting like a living thing. I heard a low, guttural sound coming from deep within the house, a sound so primal, so ancient, that it chilled me to my very core. The book was glowing now. The pages flickered, burning with an unnatural fire, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The symbols on the pages were no longer random. They were forming something. They were calling something. I couldn't see it at first, but then, slowly, deliberately, the shadows began to shift. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, as the figure, the one I had seen before, emerged from the darkness, its eyes burning like twin suns in the dark. It was here. The room seemed to stretch, elongating as the figure advanced toward me, its form growing taller with each step. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drumbeat of despair. There was no running, no escaping. I was trapped in the house, trapped in whatever this thing was. And then, as the figure reached out with its long, skeletal hand. The floor beneath me collapsed. I fell. Down, down, down. I couldn't see anything. The darkness consumed me, swirling like a tornado, pulling me deeper into the earth, into the house, into whatever it was that lay beneath it all. The falling sensation lasted forever, but I couldn't tell how much time had passed. And then I hit something hard. The ground? A stone? I wasn't sure, but there was no pain, no impact, just darkness. I opened my eyes, or tried to, but the darkness was absolute. I could feel the presence surrounding me, the suffocating weight of it pressing against my skin. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent. You are not alone. And I knew. I had crossed a line. I had descended into the heart of whatever had been festering in this house for years, feeding on the souls of those who came before me. And now, there was no way out. The house had claimed me. I was one of them now. And soon, someone else would come. Someone else would move in. Someone else would open the door. And they would hear the whispers. And they would know that the house was waiting. I don't know how much time passed. Days? Hours? It felt like years. Time was nothing in this place. It was as if the very concept of time had crumbled and dissolved, leaving me floating in an endless void. There was no sound here, only the oppressive silence, broken only by the faintest rustle in the dark corners, the faintest hint of something moving just beyond my reach. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. But I could feel it. The house was alive. I don't know how I knew that, but it was a certainty that coursed through me, deep and undeniable. The very walls, the floors, the air, they were all part of something much larger, much darker than I had ever imagined. And now, I was part of it too. I felt the presence around me, close, like an unseen hand brushing against my skin, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me from the shadows. The whispers had stopped, but I could still hear them, asterisk inside asterisk me, in the corners of my mind, faint and insistent, like a memory I couldn't quite recall. It has begun. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the voice of the house. It was the voice of him, the figure that had haunted me from the moment I stepped foot in this place. It was his voice, but it wasn't. It was the voice of everything, the voice of the house. It is time. The words were like a command, a summons, and despite every ounce of fear in my body, I knew what they meant. I had been pulled into this, dragged down into whatever this house was, whatever this thing had become. And now, I was its part, its agent, its harbinger. The air began to shift. A cold wind blew. Or maybe it was just the house itself exhaling, breathing in slow, deliberate waves. I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath me, and I felt the pull again, the pull to move. But I didn't want to move. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me. But my body moved anyway. I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff and uncoordinated, as if the very act of standing required an unnatural force. The darkness pressed against me from all sides, and I could feel the walls of the house closing in. The very air seemed to tremble, like the house was waiting for me to make a move, to walk into its depths. The floor beneath me groaned in protest, the wood cracking like the sound of bones breaking. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I took a step forward, unsure of what I was doing, but knowing I had no choice. Another step, and another. The hallway stretched out before me, its length seemingly endless, as if the house had swallowed the distance. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I hadn't noticed before, but that now seemed to pulse with life, with an insidious energy. They glowed faintly in the dark, their edges shimmering like the flicker of a dying flame. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the far end of the hallway. I froze. It was a sound I had heard before, but it was different now. It wasn't just the creaking of the old house. It was something else, something deliberate, something alive. The footsteps grew louder. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to scream, to beg, to do anything to stop what was coming. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped, and then in the stillness, I heard a door open. The sound was sharp, unnatural, as if it didn't belong to the house at all, but to something else, something far older. The shadows at the end of the hall seemed to deepen, swirling together like smoke, coalescing into a figure. The figure. I had been waiting for this. I had known it would come, but that didn't make it any easier. The figure stepped into the light, its shape monstrous, towering above me. Its eyes were the same as before, those black pits of nothing, endless and consuming. But now, they were filled with something else. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were calling me. Come. The voice was a command, an invitation, a promise. I stepped forward, unable to stop myself, as if something inside me had already made the decision. I was being led, being pulled into the darkness, drawn to the figure like a moth to the flame. I was powerless to resist. And then, as I drew closer, I saw it, the door that the figure had emerged from. It wasn't like any door I had seen before. It was ancient, its frame covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to move and writhe in the dim light. The door itself was made of blackened wood, and the air around it felt wrong. It smelled of decay, of death, of something long forgotten. The figure stepped aside, allowing me to pass. Enter. The voice echoed in my mind again, a wave of darkness crashing against my consciousness. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't resist. My hand reached for the door, and as my fingers brushed against the cold wood, I felt it. It's here. The house had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. I stepped through the door, and the world shifted. The air became thicker, heavier. The walls around me seemed to close in, their surfaces slick with something I couldn't name. The darkness inside the room was impenetrable, and I could feel the presence of something or someone watching me just beyond my sight. I couldn't breathe. I turned, and the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. I was alone, and yet I wasn't. The figure was still there, standing in the corner, watching me. Its eyes gleamed with that same cold hunger, but now there was something else, something more, a purpose. It stepped forward, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out toward me, its cold touch brushing against my cheek. And then, in the silence that followed, I understood. I was part of it now. I had crossed the threshold, and the house, asterisk the thing asterisk, had awakened. It was too quiet. I stood on the threshold of the house, the door creaking closed behind me as if it had never opened at all. The weight of what had just happened, what I had just become, settled in like a cold fog, thick and suffocating. The house was still there, its oppressive presence lingering in the air. But now, as I stepped away from its cursed walls, I couldn't help but feel detached, like I was no longer truly me. Something had changed. The house had woven itself into my very essence, and I had no idea how to undo it. I stumbled forward, the gravel of the driveway crunching beneath my feet as I moved without thought. I was free, but I wasn't. I was outside, but the house, the darkness, was still with me. There was no escape, no true freedom. I glanced back once. The house loomed behind me, silent and imposing. The windows were dark, as if it were watching me, waiting, and then I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It's time. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't the figures either. It was the voice of the house itself, a deep, hollow echo that seemed to rattle the very foundations of my soul. I felt the pull again, faint but insistent. The curse hadn't been broken, it had simply been passed. The house had marked me, and now I was the one who would wait for the next. I started walking faster, the need to escape growing within me, but no matter how fast my feet carried me, I couldn't outrun the dread that had settled in my chest. I was changed. I knew that now. I reached the street. The house behind me had disappeared into the gloom of the evening fog, but its presence lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the sidewalk, but I barely noticed it. My thoughts were consumed by the house, by the things it had done to me, and what it had made me do. Will I ever be free of it? I didn't know. The question felt irrelevant now, as if it had never mattered. All I knew was that the house had claimed me, and soon it would claim another. I could feel it. The way the air around me seemed to crackle with that same unseen energy, the same twisted hunger. As I walked, I saw a figure in the distance, a person, a stranger, walking toward me on the same side of the street. The sight of another human being should have comforted me, should have made me feel less alone. But instead, a deep, instinctual panic surged through me. I couldn't let them see me. I couldn't let them know. I turned quickly, ducking into an alleyway, my heart racing. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, trying to calm my breathing, but it was no use. The whispers were growing louder again, filling my mind with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I was the house now. It was inside me, and soon someone else would come to take my place. I thought of the woman who had lived here before me, the one who had fled in terror, babbling about curses, hearing footsteps, feeling the cold fingers of the house on her skin. She hadn't been the first to feel it, and she wouldn't be the last. The house had always been like this, always hungry, always waiting, always moving. I had become part of it, and now it was my turn to wait. I took one last glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the house, standing in the street, watching me, but there was no one there, just the empty, fog-covered road. I closed my eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on me like an anchor, and then I opened them again. There, at the far end of the alley, I saw it, the faint outline of the house. It wasn't visible in the way a normal building would be. It was more like an impression, a dark, shifting shape looming against the horizon, just beyond the edge of my sight. It was still there, always there, waiting for the next person to walk into its grasp. And then I realized, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, that I had been marked. The house had chosen me, and now it was time to pass it on. The whispers came again, louder this time, all around me, until they were deafening. Asterisk, it's time. It's time. It's time, asterisk. I turned away from the alley and stepped into the street. My mind felt numb, as though something had taken control of my body, guiding me forward, pulling me toward whatever waited for me next. The house wasn't finished with me. It was never finished, and soon it would find another. As I walked away from the place I used to call home, I heard the familiar creak of floorboards, the faintest whisper of footsteps behind me. But this time, I didn't turn around. I was no longer the person who had moved into that house. I was something else now, something in between, and wherever I went, the house would follow. I could still hear it, its whispering, waiting, always calling for the next. I was the house's legacy now, and it would never stop hunting. Story 3. Rachel had always been drawn to the unexplained. As a seasoned investigative journalist, she had chased stories all over the country, stories that many dismissed as mere superstition or folk tales. But Hollow Creek felt different. It wasn't just another strange town. It was a place where reality seemed to blur with the supernatural. The town had been abandoned by most of its original inhabitants, yet every year, people would mysteriously disappear after stepping into the surrounding woods. There were no bodies, no traces, just empty spaces where people had once stood. After reading about it in a dusty old article, Rachel knew she had to uncover the truth. She made her way to the town of Hollow Creek on a crisp autumn afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the decaying structures of the town. The streets were deserted, and the few people who remained in the town seemed to shuffle about their business, their eyes constantly shifting toward the shadows of the forest that bordered the settlement. As Rachel walked down the narrow, cracked streets, the houses seemed to lean in on her, their broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. The air felt stale, almost suffocating, and the silence was unnatural. There was something about this place, something that set her nerves on edge, but Rachel was no stranger to unsettling environments. She had been in dangerous situations before and always prided herself on maintaining her calm. She found herself standing in front of the local diner, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow against the gloomy backdrop. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the scent of stale coffee and grease. A few locals sat at tables, their heads bent low, speaking in hushed tones. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. The man behind the counter, a frail, grizzled figure with a weathered face, looked up as Rachel entered. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing, before he spoke. "You don't want to go out there, Missy," he rasped, his voice cracked from years of disuse. "The woods don't like strangers." Rachel forced a polite smile, setting her camera bag on the counter. "I'm just passing through, looking for a story. Nothing to worry about." He let out a low, throaty chuckle. "A story, huh? Well, you won't find what you're looking for in those woods. People vanish. No reason, no warning. Just gone." He leaned in closer, his breath sour and damp. "The woods, they call to you, girl. Don't listen to them. No good comes from it." Rachel had heard the rumors, of course, but she was determined to see for herself. "I'm not afraid of a few stories," she replied, her voice steady. The old man's eyes flickered to the window, his face drawn tight with fear. "You should be," he muttered, before turning away. The conversation ended there, but Rachel felt the weight of his warning press against her chest. Still, she shook it off, paying for her meal and grabbing a cup of coffee. Outside, the mist had thickened, swirling like a living thing around the edges of the town. The path to the woods was marked by an old wooden sign, weathered and cracked. Rachel followed it, her boots crunching on the gravel as she made her way deeper into the forest shadow. The trees seemed unnaturally tall, their trunks twisted in strange, contorted shapes, as if the forest itself was alive and watching her every move. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable tension that made her skin crawl. The fog rolled in thicker, obscuring her view and turning the world into a gray blur. Her breath quickened, her fingers tightening around the handle of her camera, but she pressed on, determined to find the answers she had come for. Then, just as she was about to step over a large, gnarled root, she heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Rachel," her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her eyes darting around, scanning the dense trees for any sign of movement. But the woods were silent, too silent. The whisper came again, this time clearer, closer. "Rachel, come closer." Rachel's stomach churned, and her instincts screamed at her to turn back. But curiosity, the same insatiable drive that had gotten her into dangerous situations time and time again, urged her forward. She lifted her camera, snapping a few quick shots of the twisted trees and the dark undergrowth, but her hands trembled. The whispers were louder now, surrounding her, calling her name, coaxing her deeper into the forest. "Rachel," the voice whispered again. "You shouldn't have come." Rachel could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her. The trees seemed to close in, their branches curling like fingers, and the whispers grew louder with each step. They were no longer just words. Now, they were commands, urging her to walk deeper into the heart of the woods. "Come closer," the voice urged. "Come to us. You're so close now. We've been waiting for you." Her breath quickened as she tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. But no matter how fast she walked, no matter which way she turned, the path before her seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees swallowing her whole. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every step felt heavier, like the forest itself was pulling her deeper into its embrace. Rachel's mind raced. She tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks on her, the rustling of leaves creating an illusion of voices. But the voices weren't the wind. They were clear, human, desperate. Rachel, the voice echoed, now frantic. "You are ours." Her pulse quickened, and she reached for her phone. It flickered on for a moment before dying, leaving her in the oppressive silence. Panic surged in her chest. She turned to retrace her steps, but the path was gone. It had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. There was no escape. The forest had changed. It was no longer the place she had entered. The trees had twisted, the roots had shifted, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to swallow the earth, pulling her deeper into the labyrinth. The whispers became frantic, the voices overlapping, growing louder and more insistent. "Leave, leave." But it was too late. She felt it, a sharp, sudden tug, as if the forest itself was pulling her down. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell, tumbling through the thick underbrush, her body slamming against rocks and roots. Her scream was cut short as the world went black. When Rachel awoke, it was to an unnatural stillness. Her body ached, and she felt the cold earth beneath her, damp and unyielding. She opened her eyes, but everything around her was dark, yet not completely. There was an eerie, faint glow from the walls, revealing ancient markings that seemed to writhe as if alive. The walls themselves felt as though they were breathing, expanding and contracting with every passing second. She sat up slowly, her mind a fog of confusion and fear. She was no longer in the forest. The trees, the fog, the whispers, they were all gone. In their place was an underground space, small and confined. The walls were made of stone, worn and cracked, with strange symbols etched into them. Her fingers brushed the markings, and she recoiled as they seemed to pulse under her touch. "Rachel," the voice came again, echoing through the chamber. This time, it was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a demand. Her heart raced, and her legs trembled as she stood. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her, as if the earth itself was alive, watching her. The whispers, now many, spoke all at once, their voices distant yet everywhere. "You belong to us," they murmured, a chorus of voices that sounded both ancient and ageless. Forever, Rachel tried to run, but the walls seemed to shift and stretch, changing with every step she took. The air was thick, suffocating. There was no way out. She stumbled forward, her eyes wide with terror, but the voices followed her. They encircled her, growing louder, until they were all she could hear. "Forever, you are one of us." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she clawed at the walls, but the stone was cold, unyielding. The voices reached a crescendo, and everything went silent. The darkness swallowed her whole. When Rachel's body was found, it was in the woods near the edge of town. Her camera was still clutched in her hand, but the pictures were distorted, blurry, unsettling images of twisted trees, shadowy figures, and what appeared to be a dark, swirling void. No one knew what had happened to her. The town buried her in the graveyard, but the whispers never ceased. People said that Rachel's voice could still be heard in the woods, faint and desperate, calling out from the trees. And late at night, when the wind howled through the branches, those who dared to listen swore they could hear her, calling out, "Trapped forever in the forest. Rachel,